Hi everybody. We're going to talk about finding your natural press today. There's a lot of history about the press. It's certainly something that I could delve into to a great degree, but I think you'll probably fall asleep if I do that. Suffice it to say that although there have to be some rules that you adhere to during the performance of an exercise in order to keep it both safe and effective, physical culture is a playful activity, and getting a heavy weight overhead is one of the greatest feelings on the planet. I mean, there's something just so victorious and triumphant about hoisting a weight aloft. And the natural press is the way to get it there without a whole lot of thought about it. I want to go through the natural press progression with you just so you can kind of get an idea that maybe things don't always need to be super strict in order for you to benefit from them, and in order for you to experience something that we definitely need right now, which is the great joy of weightlifting. In training, a lot of times we do our presses very strictly. The reason we do this is for the sake of control. It's also great for developing overall strength to be very rigid and tight during the performance of your press. The natural press can look very different. It can look very similar to a push press or jerk. It might look a little bit more like a strict press. There might be some side bend in there. And so we'll go over sort of the two different spectra on which your press might vary. The first is bend. How much lateral or rotational movement are you getting out from under the weight as you perform your press? If there's zero bend, it's probably a strict press. When I say strict press, I mean heels together, totally rigid in the trunk, free hand along the side of the body, and I'm pressing with no side bend whatsoever. That's my strict press. Also called the military press because of the at-attention stance. If there's a little, then it's probably just our classic one-arm press. Clean the bell into the rack position and wedge yourself underneath it. See, I push my hip to the side there and boom, I pressed overhead and used that hip as sort of a wedge between the floor and the bell. There's nothing wrong at all with that press unless you're doing it in a contest and somebody wants you to do a strict press, as in the Salem Kettlebell Vintage Championship. A little bit more bend, and we're probably looking at a side press, which the old timers would do with their heels only 12 inches or less apart and no leg bend, and they would just wedge under to a greater degree. We can certainly make this a little less spiny by allowing that front knee to bend as I side press. As I sweep my bell back, I'm starting the press. So there's this sort of semicircular motion as I do a side press. It takes some practice, but you'll see later on that with a little leg drive, we can turn it into something quite beautiful. And then if there is a lot of bend, you are probably looking at a bent press. which is definitely how you get a huge frickin' weight overhead in one hand. But it takes some serious practice, some great mobility, and a high degree of body awareness and skill to bench press well. It's a great exercise. It does a lot of the same things actually that a get-up does, just in a standing position. So you're still training through all three planes of motion, strengthening through all three planes of motion. There's still a combination of upper extremity, lower extremity, and trunk involvement. And like a get-up, you can get a pretty big weight overhead. So that's the bend spectrum. Zero bend, probably a strict or military press. A little bit of side bend just by wedging underneath it, that's a press. A bit more side bend and maybe some softness in one leg. Now we're getting into a side press. Then if there's a lot of trunk rotation and bend underneath the belt, it's probably a bent press. Now we'll move on to the other spectrum, which is leg involvement. What I mean here is leg action. So if there's zero, again, it's probably your strict press. Getting that bell into the rack position. The legs are on, believe me, they're doing work, but I'm not moving them at all while I perform my press. A little bit more leg involvement, maybe an active, aggressive aggression as you start your press. And you're probably looking at what's called a tempo press. The tempo press was, the barbell version of the tempo press was what got the press eliminated from Olympic weightlifting competitions because it became very difficult to judge. So the tempo press, I've got my bell in the rack position. My legs are straight, but I don't have all of my muscular contraction going on right now. I'm going to use a violent contraction of the legs and maybe a little throwing forward of the hips to get that bell overhead. It's like a small, really small version of a push press, which brings me to the next point. Zero leg drive, it's a strict press. Little leg drive by virtue of a strong relaxation contraction, it's probably a tempo press. Actively bending the knees, then driving, well, that's our push press. The problem with the press in Olympic lifting competitions is these lines all started to blur, and it's just not, it's not an easy thing to judge when you see three different versions of a press, and you're like, well, which one is technically viable? The judgment could have easily been made if they had just stuck with a strict press as the press, so that any degree of relaxation and contraction of the legs, any degree of layback would have disqualified you from the lift. It would have been very easy to judge. Problem is, nobody wanted to see that because the weights weren't that heavy. You start getting into the tempo press, very nearly push press range, and you've got people like Gerd Bonk, Vasily Alexiev, putting near 500-pound weights overhead, or 500-plus pound weights overhead, as Alexiev and Sergey Redding both did in, I think, 1973. Anyway, the push press, now we've got a deliberate leg bend. It's not only a legal part of the lift, but it's a requirement for it to be a push press. Dip and drive. down with control and you're doing a push press that might help you get up to the next heavier bell for your strict press. There's another version of the push press that we can do for repetitions if you have very good control, dubbed the Viking push press. Dip, drive, so I'm dropping actively into my next dip, boom. That gets quite leggy. If there's a dip to drive the weight overhead and to get underneath it, a lot of leg involvement, you're looking at a jerk. And I don't just mean looking at me. Bell is clean, bell is racked, dip, drive, dip. So I'm driving the bell with the legs and then I'm squatting under to catch it, and then I'll stand up. The great thing about the jerk is that you can put really heavy weights overhead with not that much fatigue, because you're using the stretch shortening cycle. Dip, drive, dip. You're using the elasticity of your fascia to get the weight overhead more than you're using actual muscular action. So the jerk, a great way to get weight overhead. The bent press, a great way to get overhead. But that doesn't mean you should do a bent jerk for your natural press. Your natural press is going to fall somewhere in the middle of these. It might be closer to a strict press with no leg involvement. It might be closer to a push press. Mine, when it comes to getting a weight overhead easily at whatever sort of cost I accrue, it's sort of a side pressing jerk. So I'll get the bell off to the side in my rack position. I'll dip with both legs and shoot my hips underneath and recover sort of from that side position. And it might be a little bit more like a side push press. If it's not that heavy, I can get the weight up there. But I really like to dip underneath when it comes to getting a big weight overhead. Once you're proficient at like the first 3 levels of each of these spectra, you'll be able to find your natural press. It'll just happen. And it's a great way to really derive pleasure from lifting and not just see it as dentistry.